Hey, it is episode 7 of Let's Talk About It. And on this, I have got our mayor, our current sitting mayor of Fresno, Mayor Jerry Dyer. And so we've got a lot to talk about, from policing reform, hey, he's going to talk about it, to a whole bunch of things based on his platform of One Fresno that we look forward to discussing on this episode of Let's Talk About It.
Hey, well, thanks again for joining us on this episode of Let's Talk About It. My name is Andrew Smith, lead pastor of Bridge Church, and with me, Mayor Jerry Dyer of Fresno. Mayor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Andrew, and feel free to call me Jerry. We don't have to be so formal with titles, so whatever makes you feel good, whatever makes the interview a little bit more relaxing.
All right. Well, I'll take your cue, Jerry. I appreciate it. And so I know your time is really precious. And I just want to say thank you again for making the time to jump in here, because there are so many things that you have a unique ability to speak into. And I want us to get to those at some point. But honestly, one of the things that I want to know, and I think some people ask, is how did you get to where you are today? I mean, police officer to police chief to now mayor. How did it all start?
Well, number one, God is good. He set the stage. There's no question in my mind how I got where I'm at. And, I think, quite frankly, there were a lot of opportunities along the way that allowed me to advance in the organization and the police department, from that of an officer to that of a police chief. Certainly, I went to school and got my education, my bachelor's and my master's degree along the way, and worked hard. But really, when God opens up doors of opportunity, we have options in life, and we can either not go through that door, or we can go through the door. And sometimes going through it, honestly, there's some fires you got to go through to get there. And the same happened, with me being the mayor. It was an opportunity.
Right.
It was not on my radar. It was the door opened, and and I, quite frankly, did not have peace in my heart or my mind until I said yes, that I would run. And thank God that I'm where I'm at now.
Well, that's great. So, what was your reservation about running? Because it just seemed like a natural progression of your career and your place and your prominence here in Fresno. So what gave you pause?
I think it was the fact that I had just finished up 40 years in law enforcement.
Wow.
Pretty demanding schedule as 18 years as a police chief, working 60, 70 plus hours a week, and subject to that on-call 24 hours a day, and not spending as much time as I would have liked to over the years with my wife or my kids or my grandchildren. I have 5 grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
So really was an opportunity for us to make up for some lost time, do some traveling, spend time with kids and grandkids. But, you got to make those decisions in life. And I believe that I made the right decision. And my wife is fully supportive, as well as my children. So it's where I am.
That's great. That's great. Well, let's just jump into it, because the last Zoom that I had with you, when you called on me and I had my high school moment where I wasn't quite paying attention, I'll be honest, and I felt like I was being called on by the teacher. You had called together a handful of us faith leaders here in the city because you wanted to be mindful post the siege on the Capitol, January 6th, and pre-inauguration. You wanted to make sure that there was peace and civility in our city. And by and large, that's because you're an outspoken follower of Jesus, but you're also now a career politician. And so how do you see those balancing and mixing to where they don't, your politics inform your faith? How do you balance that?
Well, whether it was my time as a police chief or as a mayor, it really, the foundation that I have, who I am as a person, is a person of faith, a follower of Christ. Okay. And then that's the foundation. And then the position is secondary. And in this case, being the mayor. But I do know that one thing that is so important for me as a person is that we have a community that is unified. It breaks my heart to see what's happened in our country. the division that we've seen between Republicans and Democrats, and the division between races, and the wealth gap, and all those things that we've seen. And it's so important, I believe, as elected leaders in our country, especially at the local level, that we do those things that are going to bring people together and not divide them. And that's why I refuse to get into these political conversations, because all they do is serve to divide our community and create this divide where people can't focus on the things that are important to all of us.
Sure.
And so that was the purpose that meeting, where I called upon all of you as faith leaders, and then held the news conference, and was just asking for peace in our community. Right.
Because if anything, it's existed pre the last administration in the White House, but it came to the surface in a whole new way January 6th of this year, of this Christian nationalism where people have inadvertently or intentionally really merged their faith and politics. And so what would you say to people who put more hope in who occupies a seat in an Oval Office as opposed to who reigns on a throne in an eternal kingdom? Like, how would you instruct them? Like, hey, that's not your hope. That's not your ultimate peace. Like, what would you speak to the Christian nationalists who have blended those just so much?
Well, I think what we've seen is people putting faith in a party, people putting faith in man, and not putting their faith where it should be put.
Right.
And that's in God. That's in our Lord. And I know that it is our responsibility as Christians is to live peaceable amongst our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And we should not be doing things on Twitter, and we shouldn't be doing things in our social media posts or anywhere else. Whether it's a city council member sitting up on the dais who's making comments that ultimately create this divide, we need to be unified as a people, and not focus so much on race or party as much as the fact that we are all human beings. We all have needs. We all have particular interest, but we need to set aside our own personal interest for the good of a city. And sometimes we don't see that.
Yeah. So I hear you saying people get overly myopic on their own personal interests and put their trust in people as opposed to the right place. And so that's a great reminder. And I think it's subtle, because we need to be interested in our political leaders and what they stand for and what their platforms are. Yours is One Fresno, and you want to see unity brought to our city. Speak a little bit about the platform that you ran on that is so near and dear to you, about being one Fresno.
Yeah, you bet. One Fresno, that was easy to come up with, and it really wasn't this. I have to have a campaign slogan, right?
Right.
I woke up in the middle of the night, and it came to my mind, what do I really want as the mayor of this city? And it was to have One Fresno. It was for people to come together and to focus on those things that are important to all of us. The issue of homelessness, and beautifying our city, and addressing poverty, and keeping people safe in our neighborhoods, and all of those things that are important. At least that's what I heard along the campaign trail. I was hearing the same thing from whether it was Democrats or Republicans, whether it was on the north end or the south end. I was really hearing the same thing. And so it was One Fresno. And there are people, unfortunately, Andrew, out there that love to see a divide.
Yeah.
They love to see the protests that are happening out there, and they thrive on that. And I'm not against protest or, right to assemble and freedom of speech. I'm 100% supportive of that. But when those things start to destroy a community or a nation, they become unhealthy.
Yeah.
And One Fresno, one vision, one purpose, and is really what we need as a community. And I'd like to see us get to that point again where we can actually say one nation under God, which we aren't able to say right now as a nation.
Yeah. Well, starting here locally, and I love I love the platform and the intentionality of unity. What does that look like through homelessness, from neighborhood to neighborhood? What's the church's part and role to come alongside how you see that working together here in our city?
Well, I believe the role of the church is to love people, to serve people, to not judge people, to support government, to open up the church doors, to meet the needs of some of our most disadvantaged people, to be able to leave the church and go out into their neighborhoods and into neighborhoods that maybe are unfamiliar to them. For churches on the north end to go into the south end and show some of that brotherly love to the southern part of our city. We've been doing that with our Beautify Fresno efforts. It has been so refreshing for me to see churches who may be operating in a very affluent area of Fresno, for their people to come together in the southern part of our city in a disenfranchised neighborhood and to clean up the neighborhood. And that softens the hearts of people who live in those neighborhoods. And when that happens, on a citywide basis, we're going to have unity in Fresno. When people see that people really do care about them and love them, that they're not there to judge them, that they're there to serve them and to be sacrificial in that service. Yeah, that's when Fresno is going to become a very envious city in our country.
So I've got to press in a little bit more, because it seems like the way you answered that really evoked some emotion from you, whether you've seen it firsthand, because as being a police officer, bringing peace as not just responding to crisis, like where did that emotion come from? Well,
being out there and seeing some of the folks that are less fortunate in our neighborhoods, people that, our children that grow up in broken homes, that grow up in neighborhoods that do not give them an opportunity to be successful in life. Being out there on the freeways, which I do on a weekly basis. I go out there and interact with our homeless population and get to hear some of the stories as to how they got where they're at. And to hear some of them say, thank you, Mayor, for caring about us and giving me a hug. I tell you, that is something that I believe more people should experience in our city. We have a tendency sometimes, I believe, to get very comfortable in our own neighborhoods.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's and God's people, I believe, are underutilized in many cases. And but I can say in Fresno, I've witnessed the churches be very engaged in community, more so than any city I've ever seen. We have an environment here in Fresno that has allowed for the churches, the pastors, to come together, to work together, to go into neighborhoods, to feed the homeless population, to do a number of things. So I'm very, very proud of our churches in Fresno. I really, really am. And I've seen it through bringing broken neighborhoods back to life. And what initially started in Southwest Fresno about 19, 20 years ago, when I was in the police department, having these neighborhood events, going out and barbecuing and bringing our children out there and setting up a stage with a praise band. And we took that citywide. And so it's those types of things that I believe that bring neighborhoods together. And God's people can be the catalyst for that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your faith's got feet. I mean, the fact that you're out there weekly, not just saying, hey, let's address homelessness, but you're meeting the homeless. You're hearing those stories. It's not just an issue that needs resolved. It's people who need help. That's what I hear you saying. And I think that would give feet to so many other people's faith as well, because it's so impersonal.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And what I have seen in the political arena, sometimes it's hard to gauge motives. Why is a person doing what they do? Why are they making the decisions in which they make? And I never want to lose sight of what our role is as leaders, whether it's in a political position or police chief or a pastor or anyone else in the community. I believe our roles are to be, our motives are to be pure.
Mm-hmm.
Our motives are to be one that allows us to do those things that glorify God. And it's very easy to get caught up in like housing the homeless. I must house the homeless because I made that promise.
Right.
And, it's a campaign promise. I must clean up this city because it's a campaign promise. It's more than that.
Right.
It's about restoring the soul of a city. Restoring the soul of a city by reaching those that are less fortunate and making our city a better place to live.
I love it. So let me ask you kind of like a far-reaching question. Let's say 4 years, 8 years down the line, you're no longer mayor. You're stepping into your next thing. What do you want your legacy to be? What do you want that imprint that you forever left in Fresno to be?
First and foremost, I want to see a legacy of unity in our community, where people are working together, where we have been able to set aside our differences based on party and race and economic background, that we're a community of unity. And the thing that I want people to really know about me is that I do care for people. I love people. I'm doing this for the right reasons. I know at times it's hard for people to, when you see an elected person and they show up at an event, it must be to get the votes. Mm-hmm. But, right. And you know what? Quite honestly, that's what I see most of the time. The year before an election, you'll start to see a person all of a sudden be more engaged.
Right.
But I want people to know that my motives are pure. The reason I chose to become the mayor of this city was not for personal gain, was not for economic benefit, was not to advance to another position. It was to make Fresno a better place to live.
Oh, that's great. I can't think of a better legacy when it's all said and done, that, hey, I left it better than when I got to it. And your issue about motivation, that's not just about politics. That's pastors, that's people, that's husbands and wives, that's anybody who makes any decision about anything, is that they can clarify and make obvious what their motivation is. Man, you have an incredible background that is going to allow you to speak into probably one of the biggest issues that is headline news and has been for quite some time. So last year, if you don't remember, we entered into a global pandemic. That was one thing. In the midst of that, culture got hit with the realization that the racial inequity issue isn't as far down the line as we would hope it to be. The civil rights movement didn't fix it all. It's still very much there. Now, coming from a policing background, and just recently, even like the paper's talking about your desire to want to see reform in the police department. Can you please speak to that? Because my dad, until I was 2, worked for the Indiana State Highway Patrol. Oh. And so he knows that side. We also grew up in the Southeast in Charlotte, North Carolina. So the majority of a lot of my friends growing up were Black. And you've got this tension between people of color and policing right now. And it's not that it's new. It's just that everybody's walking around with these now. And so what does reform, what does hope, what does bringing unity and oneness look like in policing, both in our city and then moving forward?
Well, I believe it's going to require middle ground. It's going to require less finger pointing and blame, and much more willingness for people to work together, to listen, to understand each other. I can tell you from coming from a law enforcement background, now sitting as the mayor, I see things differently. I have a much broader perspective. I've done a lot of listening.
Okay. So what has changed coming from that policing background, now sitting in the seat that you're in, that's given you a different perspective?
Oh, exposure. When you're in law enforcement, what you see hourly is bad stuff.
Right.
You are exposed to people who are involved in criminal activity. You're constantly involved in gang operations where you're seeing innocent people that are being shot. You're visiting. I was visiting victims in the hospital who had lost a loved one, going to funerals, vigils. So what ultimately ends up happening is you get this passion inside of you that becomes all controlling. And it is to arrest the criminals, to protect the victims. Okay. And it can be all consuming. And it's very easy for police officers, based on what neighborhoods they might be exposed to the most where the violence is, to form an opinion of everyone based on that neighborhood.
Okay.
So when you break away from that and you get to see things a little differently, I'm not constantly exposed to that. It gives me a better view of life. I get to see, I understand where police officers come from and what they have to face day in and day out, the life-threatening the decisions that they have to make, what they're exposed to. They go from call to call to call, the names they're being called, how people turn on them when they call them for help and then they turn on them, the emotions that are involved. And then I get to hear from from folks in the community that have had negative encounters with police,
right.
For whatever reason. And so it allows me as a mayor to see we need to recognize that there's a middle ground, that there are police officers who are bad, that abuse their position. There are police officers that perhaps start out their profession is with good motives, without necessarily a bias, that ultimately develop a bias. And that bias is what causes them to make decisions that they normally wouldn't make. And it's based on their exposure and experience. And the same with community members who may have been exposed to some negative police, or maybe they've been raised in a background where they're taught to not respect the police. And so I think we have the perfect storm that has been fueled a lot by social media, with videos of police officers not performing in the right way that goes viral.
Yeah, no. And it's very much there. And if you're conditioned to be a hammer, then everything becomes a nail. Right. And if there has to be a middle, we understand like something's got to change, because if something isn't done, then nothing's going to change. And if you follow certain people's Instagram posts, you follow a guy like Sean King that has a lot of accessibility to video, there is an issue. So is it training? Is it better public relations, neighborhood relations? What are some steps? Because honestly, let me get personal here for a second. 3 men just now finally got indicted on the Ahmaud Arbery murder last year. Young African-American kid out for a jog. One of my best friends is Black. His son is 22. That's not some faceless kid to me. That's my friend's son. And I go, how do we take steps to ensure that our African-American friends or our friends of color aren't scared of the police from what they're saying?
Yeah. Well, I had a meeting with some folks yesterday to talk about this very thing.
Yeah.
And it is a constant reinforcement. It is constant training. It is constantly making police officers aware of the fact that they do have a bias. They need to recognize they have a bias. And whatever that bias is, and once you are aware you have that bias, perhaps that allows you to recognize it more quickly. And sometimes that bias can form based on the way a person looks. It could be skin color, could be dress, could be tattoos that a person has. It could be all of those things that cause a police officer to become overly suspicious of a person and ultimately treat that person differently than they would treat someone else. And so it's that awareness, it's that training, and it is, I also believe, incumbent upon law enforcement leaders to not allow certain police officers to remain in certain positions or environments too long, because it does something to them. And I moved a lot of police officers over the years from assignments because I started to see something that wasn't healthy, and to take them from policing the South End and move them into the Northeast Fresno, to take them out of a special unit that deals with gangs every single day,
right,
and put them into a school resource officer position. So it requires a lot of that. I understand it. When you talk about some of the incidents that have occurred across our nation, I think a really good positive step, and it's unfortunate it happened, was the prosecution and conviction of Derrick Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
It was an out and out murder. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. If you look at that video, that was shocking to the conscience of America. And I had never seen anything like that in my entire career. So that was a good start.
Well, that's good. And it's so good to hear you articulate that. You say that was justice served in the right way, because I think people are fearful that is this license? And no, it's not. There has to be accountability. And as not only a mayor of our city, but as a man of faith, we serve a God of justice and of due process. One day we're all going to face that.
That's right.
To some degree, but to know that where prosecution needs to happen, it'll happen, because our nation is grieving and reeling from the reality that, man, we are not as far down the line in this racial inequity as we thought we were. We have not woken up to the place that we had originally thought that we were. And it's just, I think, if anything else, bringing to the surface again that we have a lot of work to do. And so that's where, on your platform of One Fresno, of oneness, of bringing unity and reconciliation. So what is the city? What's a practical thing that the city can do outside of the policing issue to really bridge that gap in bringing racial equity to our city? Because honestly, let me just speak frankly, like, we have a murder rate because of COVID and people being home more that has escalated. And so some people are scared to go into some areas, but that cross-pollinating of people remaining and seeing people as human is necessary. But how do we do it when it seems like it's volatile in areas and safe in other areas? And like, help.
Yeah. So we know where the vast majority of violence occurs in our city. Mm-hmm. And it's like that across the nation. It is in certain neighborhoods, but it's not necessarily restricted to those neighborhoods. Violence can happen anywhere. Shooting can happen anywhere.
Sure.
It's happened, unfortunately, at Fashion Fair a couple of times. So it can happen anywhere. But what I do know from my experience in law enforcement is that it's more likely to happen in certain neighborhoods where there has been historically concentrated poverty, where neighborhoods have been left behind, forgotten, where there are single parent families or no parents perhaps in the home. The guidance isn't there for youth. And so what we can do as a society is try to make up for some of those things that have occurred in the past that will remember those neighborhoods. Remember the people in those neighborhoods, whether that is making sure that we're cleaning their neighborhoods, paving their streets, trimming their trees, transforming their communities like we're doing in Southwest Fresno with about $177 million investment in West Fresno, largest investment in our history. Wow. State Center Community College building a campus there that's going to have the largest automotive training facility west of the Mississippi. Market rate housing, single family housing, green space, alternative transportation modes, hiring people from those neighborhoods that have oftentimes not been hired. So all of that is so important to us as we move forward. But it is remembering the forgotten neighborhoods and doing something about it.
Yeah, no, that is those are some of the things that I think as a faith leader of leading a lot of people here at Bridge Church that we can really put feet to our faith and partner with our city, because our vision here is to be a church for the valley. We don't want to just be a church for ourselves. We want to make sure that we're leaving this city a better place than we originally found it. This isn't a question that's on our list. It's not a curveball. So don't look, you're like, oh, he's gonna throw in a weird one. What is a message that you would hope as our mayor, that as pastors we're conveying to our congregations? And it was one that I was thinking of the other day, because I thought that's one of the greatest ways to communicate not only your faith, but your desire for our city via the conduit that you have in relationship and connectivity to pastors in the city. And what would that be?
The message of hope, the message of encouragement, the message that things are going to get better, the message that we need to come together to encourage one another, to support one another. We need to put our faith over politics. We need to put our faith into the neighborhoods. All of those things, I think, are messages that are so meaningful today for the church. Yeah. I've been to, I've spoken to a lot of churches over the years, shared my testimony, and how what I was like before Christ and what I was like after Christ.
Right.
And I also think the message needs to be in our church, one of salvation, making sure that we're loving people and giving them an opportunity to ultimately end up having the same opportunities we do in being saved. Not judging people, loving people right where they're at, whether they're living on our freeways, homeless, or they're a drug addict, or wherever they're at, to love them where they're at, and to give them an opportunity to come to know Christ.
Yeah. Wow. So ultimately, it's not a political, temporal answer to any long systemic problem. It really is an eternal theological answer, as you see, to the bigger issues. Because one of the things that you've said over and over and over is the necessity to humanize people. I don't know if that's an overt theme that you thread in your discussions, but whether that's oneness from neighborhoods that are in localized poverty, whether that's homeless, moving police officers away from places that might harden them over time, is what we need to do to continue to humanize the other and see other people for the way in which we want them to see us. Is that accurate?
Very, very, very accurate, Andrew, because, when I was sitting in the police department, I saw the homeless population much differently than I see it today.
Yeah.
What I saw was the effects of the homeless population in our city, the litter, the associated crime, the number of calls for police service as a result of the homeless in the neighborhood.
Right.
Today, as the mayor, I see that differently. I see that those people they weren't born homeless. There was something that in their life that triggered them to become homeless. And I've heard the stories. And so I'm able to honestly love those people right where they're at, but not willing to leave them where they're at.
That's good.
And so it's helped me to see that about people. And I do think from time to time as Christians, we can all become a little bit like I was as a police chief. You see people, I hear it from businesses, they get so upset, so angry with the homeless population, and understandably so, because they do things at their businesses that really impact them in a negative way.
Right.
And so I want to respect that, but at the same time, we have to love people where they're at.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Well, Mayor, I know that you have an upcoming meeting with the medical community here in Fresno, Clovis. And I really do just appreciate you taking the time and being willing to sit down and for us to talk about a bunch of things that I know a whole bunch of folks, if they could just bring up a chair and ask you a handful of questions, they would want to ask. One of the things I'm curious, what questions do you have for me, Bridge Church, or faith community from your seat? I'll put you on the hot seat for a second.
Well, I always want to know from whether it's a church or a pastor, whatever the group is, what the expectation of the church is of government. What is the expectation that folks have of me? It's easy for me as a mayor to say I want the churches to be more engaged in neighborhoods.
Sure.
So what is the expectation of the Bridge Church for me as the mayor of the city?
Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire Bridge Church, but one of the things that I appreciate about you is your honesty. Your honesty to be able to say, at one point I saw it one way, and now in a new seat I see it a different way. Your willingness to put feet to your faith. I've said this multiple times throughout our interview, not just sit in an office and speculate how to solve a problem, but be boots on the ground. And in doing so, you've really shown in our time together the importance of humanizing people, because we can refer to people as they or them, and we can categorize folks based on stereotypes or hurts or vantage points. But one of the things that you said is when we humanize them, when we see them for who they are, those things begin to melt away. And so I think that's one of the most important things that people can have faith in their leadership, is that overt honesty and humanizing that you have done for the city and the issues that you want to address. They're not just issues, they're people. They're people with stories, and you've gotten into that.
Yeah.
And that's wildly encouraging.
Well, I appreciate that, Andrew. And yeah, just the other thing is just keep praying for us. Please pray for me and for my family, and for all of the our police officers, for safety, our firefighters, all of our employees. What I'm trying to establish here in Fresno is a culture that says we work for you. Yeah. And so I want everybody to understand we work for you. We work for the people of Fresno. The vision I have for Fresno is an inclusive, prosperous, beautiful city where people take pride in their neighborhood and their community, a government that listens, keeps its promises, and is owned by the people. And we need a lot of work in order to fulfill that vision. But we need folks like you praying for us, congregations praying for us,
sure,
so that we can do that.
Sure. Hey, on that note, well said. Thank you again, Mayor, for your time, Jerry. It feels weird saying Jerry, but you gave me permission. But thank you for taking the time. I appreciate some of the insight and your words about your perspective and our city, and some of the insight that you brought. So thank you.
Thank you, brother. I love you. God bless you.
All right. Take care.